Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. My name is Margaret Caldwell, and for years I swallowed every excuse my son and his wife gave me for why I was never at birthdays, never at Thanksgiving, never even at Christmas morning. I told myself families drift, that maybe they were protecting me from the noise, until the day my daughter-in-law leaned across the table at brunch and hissed that I was forbidden from the family party because everyone was happier without me. What she never imagined was that I still held the deed to the house they thought of as theirs, that I carried proof of the $170,000 they had taken and never repaid, and that the woman she tried to erase was about to remember her power. I was stirring the straw in my iced tea when Jessica leaned across the table, her perfume cutting through the smell of bacon and coffee. Her voice dropped so low, I almost thought I had misheard her. "Mom, you don't need to come to the family party anymore. We all feel so much more relaxed without you there." The clatter of dishes and hum of conversation at the brunch spot in Raleigh carried on around us, but for me, the world seemed to go quiet. I held the glass steady, my hand tighter than it needed to be, and forced a small smile. If I let my face slip, if I showed the sting, I felt she would see it as victory. So I said nothing, only nodded as if she had just mentioned the weather. Jessica's lips curved into the kind of smile people practice in mirrors, perfect for photographs, but empty at the core. She pushed a piece of avocado toast around her plate, her eyes scanning the room to see if anyone had caught her moment of triumph. My son Michael was not here. She had arranged this brunch alone with just the two of us. That told me everything. I took a sip of my tea. The ice clinked against the glass. A small part of me wanted to slam it down to tell her she had no right, but another voice in my head whispered that if I did, she would only twist it later, make me sound unstable. I had seen that look in her eyes before, the satisfaction of pulling strings no one else seemed to notice. Most mothers would throw a fit. She continued, still pretending this was casual, almost friendly. "But you've been so understanding." The words were sugar, but her tone was steel. My fork hovered over my plate. I thought of birthdays I had missed these past years, Christmas mornings with only a phone call, Thanksgiving dinners that came and went without an invitation, all explained away by Michael as work trips or the kids catching colds. Now I saw the truth laid out in front of me with the same clarity as the morning light pouring through the tall windows. She had orchestrated it all, and Michael had gone along with it. I dabbed at the corner of my mouth with a napkin, my hand steady though my chest felt tight. I thought I had been patient, telling myself grown children drift lives, get busy, new traditions form. I excused the distance as something natural, but listening to Jessica whisper her little confession, I knew it had been deliberate. She leaned back in her chair, her pearl earrings catching the light. "It's better this way," she added softly, her eyes fixed on me as though testing for cracks. "The kids don't get confused about whose rules to follow. Michael feels less pressure. Everyone is happier. Everyone but me, I thought. Yet even as the ache settled in my chest, something else stirred. A spark. It was faint, but it was there, cutting through years of silence and compromise. I lifted my coffee cup, letting the steam brush my face. My voice came out calm, almost detached. "I see." Jessica seemed pleased, nodding like a teacher rewarding a student. "I knew you would understand," she said. I let her words hang there between us. I did not argue. I did not protest. But inside something shifted. The brunch continued meaningless talk about her new yoga instructor and Michael's latest project. I responded with polite murmurs, my mind miles away. When the check arrived, she reached for it with a flourish, as if generosity could soften the cruelty of what she had just delivered. "Thank you," I said quietly. She seemed satisfied, convinced she had won something. Outside, the sun was bright, the air heavy with early summer warmth. In the parking lot, she hugged me, her arms stiff, her cheek brushing mine with the faintest pressure. I could feel her certainty radiating the assurance that she had secured her position, cemented her control. I stood by my car as she drove away, her white Lexus gliding out of the lot, polished and confident. For a long moment, I did not move. The world around me buzzed with normal life families, gathering couples, laughing waiters carrying trays. To them, I was just another older woman lingering after a meal. But inside me, the ground had shifted. I started the engine and let the air conditioner roar to life. My hands rested on the wheel, but I did not pull out right away. Jessica believed she had erased me from my own family. She thought her whisper at brunch would be the final stroke. What she did not know, what even Michael seemed to have forgotten, was that I was not powerless. As I sat there, the hum of traffic in my ears, I realized the truth that had been hiding under grief and routine. They had pushed me aside, yes, but the house I returned to, the life I had built with David, still rested in my name. The power Jessica believed she held was only smoke. I shifted into drive and pulled onto the street. The familiar trees of Raleigh lined the road, their leaves swaying in the warm breeze. For years, I had driven this same path back to the home where I raised my son, where memories lived in every corner. Today, though, each mile felt different, because now I knew this was not just about being excluded from a party. This was about being erased from a family I had given everything to. And if they thought I would sit quietly and accept it, they were about to learn how wrong they were. As I turned onto my street, the sight of my house came into view, its brick front warmed by the sunlight, roses blooming along the porch David built decades ago. The house had always felt like a refuge, the one place untouched by judgment. Yet that morning, even it seemed to whisper to me, "Change is coming." I parked in the driveway, sat with the engine ticking in the quiet, and let the thought settle. Jessica believed she had closed a door on me forever. What she never considered was that I still held the keys to open other doors entirely. When I stepped inside my house that afternoon, the quiet hit me harder than usual. The screen door creaked shut behind me, and the air carried the faint scent of the roses blooming along the porch. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains and landed on the hardwood floor, the same floor where Michael had once sprawled with toy cars spread around him. The silence now felt like it was listening, waiting for me to acknowledge what Jessica's whisper had truly meant. I set my purse on the entry table, the one David and I had picked out at a flea market the year after we married, and walked slowly into the living room. The couch sagged a little on the right side, where David always liked to sit with the paper folded just so. I could almost hear the rustle of pages, the steady tap of his pen when he did the crossword. My eyes moved to the mantel lined with photographs. Michael as a toddler grinning with ice cream smeared across his cheeks. Michael in his graduation gown cap slightly askew because he never liked rules even then. Our wedding photo in black and white, David's smile steady and sure, my hand looped through his arm. I reached out and touched the frame dust clinging faintly to my fingers. For years, these images had been a comfort proof that once we had been a family built on laughter and milestones. Now they felt almost like evidence, a record of something that had been rewritten in my absence. Jessica might erase me from invitations, but these walls still carried my name. I sank into David's old chair, the fabric worn but sturdy, and let myself breathe. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. Every corner told a story. In the kitchen, I could still picture myself leaning over the stove, Michael's small voice at my elbow begging for a taste. The back door still had the scratch marks from when our old golden retriever tried to claw his way inside during thunderstorms. On the porch, the swing David hung for me still swayed gently when the wind picked up. The garden was my husband's pride. Roses in careful rows, colors blending into one another. He used to come in with dirt under his nails and a triumphant grin, placing a single bloom in a jar on the counter. I walked outside now, the late afternoon air heavy with perfume. The petals were soft when I brushed them with my fingertips. David had planted them for me, insisting they would outlast both of us. Standing there, I felt his presence more than ever, as if he were reminding me that beauty and strength endure even when people forget. As I moved back inside, I noticed the file cabinet in the study, its metal drawers closed and waiting. A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. David had stood in that very room one evening years ago, the lamplight on his face. He told me clearly that the deed was in my name alone. He wanted to be sure I would always have security no matter what. At the time, I brushed it off, too focused on dinner in the oven or bills on the counter. But now his words replayed with a new weight. My name only. Not Michael's, not Jessica's. Mine. I opened the drawer slowly, fingertips brushing across folders. The neat handwriting on labels, the orderly stacks of documents, all spoke of the care David had taken. I did not pull out the deed just then, but I knew it was there. I could almost hear his voice telling me to remember. A calm spread through me, stronger than the sting of Jessica's dismissal. In the hallway mirror, I caught sight of myself. My hair streaked with gray lines around my mouth, etched from years of worry, but my eyes were steady. I was not powerless. Jessica believed she had closed me off, reduced me to a background figure, but she had no idea of the foundation under my feet. This house, these memories, the life David and I had built, all of it stood with me. I walked from room to room, letting the past guide me. In Michael's old bedroom, the shelves still held a few forgotten trophies and paperbacks with dog-eared pages. I ran my hand over his desk, remembering the nights I sat beside him while he wrestled with math homework. He had once looked up at me with frustration and said he could never figure it out, and I had told him he was capable of more than he thought. The irony of that memory struck me now. In the dining room, the table bore faint scratches from years of dinner's elbows and restless children. I remembered birthday candles melting too quickly while Michael's friends shouted for him to blow them out. I remembered David carving the Thanksgiving turkey while I passed mashed potatoes, laughter filling the space. The sound was gone now, but the weight of it lingered in the wood. I paused by the front window, watching a car roll by on the quiet street. Neighbors waved as they returned from errands, unaware of the storm that had just passed through my life. To them, I was the same Maggie Turner who tended her roses and waved politely. They did not know that inside me something had shifted forever. The evening light deepened and shadows stretched across the living room floor. I returned to David's chair and sat down heavily. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. Jessica wanted me to feel erased. She wanted me to accept her version of the family, one where I no longer belonged. But in that moment, surrounded by the house I had built, I realized she had overlooked the most important fact. David had trusted me with everything. He had made sure my name carried the weight. The more I thought about it, the more that spark inside me grew. I was not invisible. I was not discarded. I had strength, and soon I would remember how to use it. I leaned back, my hands gripping the arms of the chair, and whispered to the empty room. "You were wrong, Jessica. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking the hour. I sat there until the sound faded my resolve, steady my path clearer than it had been in years. It had not started with that brunch, though. The signs had been there for years, scattered like breadcrumbs I chose to ignore. 3 birthdays in a row had passed without an invitation, each one explained away with a flimsy excuse. Michael would call me the day before, or sometimes the morning of, his voice rushed, telling me work had come up, or the kids were sick, promising to make it up to me another time. But photographs would appear later on social media, balloons, cake-smiling faces. My absence was never mentioned. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was a misunderstanding. Children get sick. Plans change. The second time stung more. I remember standing in the kitchen holding the phone after Michael hung up and staring at the calendar where I had circled Emma's birthday. I had already wrapped a book about sea animals I thought she would love. It sat in my closet for months untouched. By the 3rd year, the truth could not be ignored. Jessica had arranged an elaborate party at a rented hall, every detail curated, every photo polished. Friends and relatives posted about it, but not one word came from my own son. He called the day after, apologizing, vaguely telling me Emma had been so tired and it was better to keep things simple. I remember gripping the phone and forcing my voice steady, but my chest ached with the weight of what I knew. It was not just birthdays. Thanksgiving became another quiet evening in my house, the table set for one. I roasted a small chicken instead of a turkey, telling myself it was easier that way. Michael would text me a quick, "Happy Thanksgiving." No photos of the children, no invitations to join. I watched the parades on television and tried to convince myself I preferred the quiet. Christmas, too, shifted into silence. Where once stockings hung along my mantle, now only dust gathered. Michael would stop by with the kids days later, hurried visits where they stayed just long enough to unwrap a present before Jessica claimed they needed to leave. I would watch them climb into the car, my granddaughter waving through the window, while Jessica tapped impatiently on her phone. Emma noticed. She always noticed. One afternoon, she called me from her tablet, her face filling the screen. "Grandma, why weren't you at my party?" Her voice was light, but puzzled, her brows drawn together. I felt the sting of tears, but I forced a smile. "Sweetheart, I wasn't invited this time." She tilted her head, confusion plain in her young eyes. "But Mommy said you were busy and didn't like big crowds." The lie hit me harder than any whispered insult. I told her I loved her parties and would never be too busy for her. She nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty flicker across her face, as if she was torn between what I said and what her mother had told her. After we hung up, I sat staring at the blank screen, my hands trembling. The pattern repeated itself so many times it became impossible to dismiss. Always the same excuses from Michael, always the same carefully crafted reasons. Work trip, children tired, Jessica not feeling well. And yet the photos proved otherwise. Smiles captured without me. Traditions carried on as though I had never been a part of them. I began to realize it was not neglect or accident. It was a strategy, a steady, deliberate erasure. If I was not present at birthdays, Thanksgivings, or Christmas mornings, then in time the children would remember those moments without me. Their memories would form around Jessica and Michael, their grandmother becoming nothing more than a faded name on a card. That knowledge sat heavy on my chest. I had spent years telling myself I could endure being on the outside, that eventually they would include me. The evidence was undeniable. I was going to pull out the not simply for one party, not for a single holiday, but for the long term. The memory of Emma's voice asking why I was not there haunted me most of all. Her innocence made the cruelty behind it sharper. Jessica was not only shutting me out, she was reshaping how my granddaughter understood me. That was the part that lodged like a stone in my throat. I found myself wandering the house more often, tracing the outlines of photographs, listening to the silence, wondering how long it would take before the children stopped asking about me altogether. A chill moved through me at the thought. If Jessica had her way, Emma and Noah would grow up believing their grandmother had chosen not to be part of their lives. One evening, as I stood by the window watching the sun fade over the garden, the truth settled deep inside me. This was not thoughtless neglect. It was calculated. Jessica was writing me out of the story of my own family, and Michael, whether blind or willing, was letting her. The realization burned, but alongside the pain, something stronger began to rise. For the first time in years, I saw the shape of the battle I was in. I had been telling myself I was powerless, that silence was the only option. But silence had only fed her control. If I wanted my grandchildren to remember who I truly was, if I wanted my life to mean more than empty holidays and quiet excuses, I would have to act. The decision had not yet formed into specifics, but the seed was there. I turned from the window, the glow of the setting sun catching the photographs on the mantel. David's smile, Michael's childhood grin, Emma's first school picture. Evidence that I belonged, evidence that I mattered. Jessica could try to erase me, but I could feel the strength gathering in me now. I sat in David's chair, the familiar fabric under my hands, and whispered to myself in the dimming light, "She will not win. Not this time." The evening had settled heavy over Raleigh when the phone rang, its sharp tone breaking through the quiet house. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the screen lit up with Michael's name, and something inside me still compelled me to answer. I pressed the button and lifted it to my ear. "Mom," he began without pause. His voice hurried but too polished, like he had rehearsed. "We've been thinking about fixing up the playroom for the kids. It really needs new flooring, maybe, built-in shelves, a fresh coat of paint." He hesitated just long enough to make it sound casual. "I was hoping you could help us out. Nothing big. 7,000 should cover it." The words fell flat in the kitchen air, landing on me with a weight that felt heavier than the number itself. 7,000, like it was spare change, like asking me was the most natural thing in the world. I gripped the edge of the counter and looked at the neat row of roses swaying just outside the window roses David had planted for me decades ago. "Michael," I said slowly, "I am not loaning money anymore." There was silence on the line long enough that I thought perhaps he hadn't heard me. Then his tone shifted, the warmth gone. "What are you talking about?" "You've always helped us before. It's for the kids, Mom." I closed my eyes. I could picture Jessica standing nearby, arms folded, her gaze sharp as she urged him forward. "No," I said firmly. "Not this time." He gave a short laugh, brittle, humorless. "You can't be serious. 7,000. You live alone in that big house, you've got plenty. What else are you doing with it?" The question hit me like a slap. Not asked out of curiosity or concern, but out of calculation. My own son measuring my worth in dollars, assuming my life was empty if not poured into theirs. I swallowed, forcing my voice calm. I am not doing this, Michael. I am not giving out loans anymore. His sigh was sharp-cutting. This is ridiculous. You're starting to sound paranoid. Ever since Dad died, you've been different. Suspicious. You don't even trust your own family. Paranoid. The word echoed through me like a cold wind. Jessica had accused me of being too dramatic, of not fitting in. Now Michael dismissed me as paranoid. The dismissal was worse than anger. It reduced me to someone whose feelings were not to be taken seriously. I leaned against the counter, gripping the phone tightly. No, Michael. I said, my voice low but steady. I am clearer than I have been in years. He muttered something under his breath, maybe a curse, then snapped, Fine. Forget it. Before I could reply, the line went dead. I stood there in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I set the phone down slowly, my hand trembling. His words circled in my head, colliding with memories of all the excuses the birthdays missed. Emma's puzzled little face, asking why Grandma wasn't there. The pattern was so clear now it burned. I turned toward the hallway and walked to David's study. The door creaked open, the familiar smell of old paper and wood polish wrapping around me. For years I had avoided this room, leaving it untouched, as if keeping it closed could keep David's absence from overwhelming me. But tonight I needed answers. The file cabinet stood against the wall, solid and unyielding. I pulled open the top drawer, the sound of metal scraping against metal. Neat rows of folders lay inside each one, labeled in David's careful hand. Insurance, investments, mortgage, taxes, and then one that stopped me cold. Michael. My chest tightened as I pulled the folder free. It was thicker than I expected, heavy with documents the weight of years. I set it on the desk and sat in David's chair, the fabric worn smooth by his shoulders. For a long moment, I only rested my hand on the folder, my pulse loud in my ears. I had told Michael no. For the first time in years, I had drawn a line. He had called me paranoid. But David had never been careless. If there was something in these papers, I would find it. I opened the folder. The first pages were yellowed copies of bank transfers. Then came a typed agreement. My breath caught as I read the numbers. $50,000 dated 8 years ago, a loan to Michael for a business venture. Repayment due within 3 years with modest interest. Signed by David and Michael both. I traced the signature with my finger, the ink faded but clear. No repayments were recorded. I knew because I checked the bank statement stacked beside it, meticulous notes in David's handwriting. Nothing had ever been returned. I flipped through more pages. Another document appeared, this one marked 5 years ago. $75,000 toward a down payment on Michael and Jessica's house. A letter in David's hand described it as a gift, but clipped to it was a note in Michael's writing promising to repay when circumstances improved. My vision blurred. Their circumstances had improved. The vacations in Europe, Jessica's BMW, the private school tuition for Emma. I had seen the photos, heard the casual mentions, but the repayments had never come. My hands trembled as I sorted through the rest. Smaller notes, 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Promises written but never honored. Each one a reminder of how blind I had been, how thoroughly I had let David handle the finances, while I told myself everything was fine. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of it pressing down. My son had not just asked for money tonight. He had built a history of taking year after year, always with excuses, always with promises. And Jessica, who whispered me out of birthdays and dinners, had lived off the generosity they never acknowledged. I closed the folder slowly and placed my hand flat on the cover. My breath was unsteady, but my mind was sharp. Michael had wanted 7,000 more, believing I would not question it, but David had left me the truth tucked neatly into these drawers. The word paranoid no longer stung. If anything, it fueled me. I was not paranoid. I was finally seeing clearly. The lamp cast a circle of light across the desk, illuminating the folder, the evidence of years of quiet betrayal. For the first time since David's death, I felt him near. Not in the ache of absence, but in the steady way he had prepared for this moment, ensuring that I would have the proof I needed. I sat there for a long time, the folder open before me, the silence of the house no longer oppressive but alive with possibility. Michael thought he could call and demand, thought he could shame me into giving more. But tonight I had found the truth. I reached for the drawer again, sliding it closed with finality. My hands no longer shook. Tomorrow I would decide what to do with what I had learned. For tonight it was enough to know that I was not powerless, not paranoid, and certainly not blind any longer. The folder lay heavy on the desk, its edges sharp under my fingertips. I turned another page, then another each sheet, a piece of the puzzle David had quietly left behind. The dates stretched back more than a decade, and as I read the figures, my stomach tightened. The first big one I found was from 2012, a neat contract typed on David's old typewriter and signed by Michael in thick black ink. Loan amount $60,000. Purpose startup venture in Raleigh, some kind of tech consulting company he had bragged about to me at the time. I remembered the excitement in his voice, how he spoke about investors circling and a product that would change everything. I had believed him then, proud that my son had ambition. I had not known that David had advanced him the money himself. The repayment terms were clear. Within 3 years, modest interest added. Nothing had ever been repaid. I traced Michael's signature, the loops in his name, too familiar. My throat felt tight. He had smiled at me through holidays, hugged me on brief visits, all while never acknowledging this debt. All while letting Jessica whisper excuses for why I was not invited. I turned to the next section. A thick packet of documents dated 2016, the year Michael and Jessica bought their house in Cary. $90,000 listed as a down payment contribution. Attached was a letter David had written, formal and kind, calling it assistance for their family home. But clipped to it was another piece, a handwritten note in Michael's own scrawl. I promise to pay this back when things are better. 5 words underlined for emphasis. I let the paper slip from my hands. Things were better now. I knew that much from the BMW Jessica drove the vacations to Italy and France they posted about the private school tuition for Emma and Noah. Circumstances had improved years ago, and still nothing. I kept digging page after page. Smaller amounts at first, $10,000 here for medical bills, $5,000 there for a car, repair a handful of checks marked as temporary assistance. Together they added up to more than $20,000. In the margins, David had written careful notes, reminders to follow up records of conversations. When I added it all together, the figure stopped me cold. More than $170,000 had flowed from this house, from David's and my savings, directly into Michael's hands. Most of it without my knowledge. None of it ever returned. I leaned back in the chair, my palms flat on my thighs. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. 17 years of raising a child, teaching him right from wrong, believing he would carry forward the values we tried to instill. And here was the truth inked in his own hand. He had taken advantage again and again. Images flashed through my mind. Michael at 10 years old, his hair sticking up as he grinned after riding his bike down the street. Michael at 22 clutching his diploma, his eyes filled with promise. Michael at 30 holding his newborn daughter, telling me I would be the best grandmother. Those versions of him blurred against the man who had just called me paranoid for refusing him 7,000 more. A wave of nausea passed over me. I stood and walked to the window, pushing it open to let in the cool night air. The roses below stirred in the breeze, their petals pale under the moonlight. I gripped the sill, my fingers digging into the wood. For years, I had told myself my distance from them was natural, that time changed families. But this folder proved otherwise. It was not distance. It was design. David had known. That realization came to me with painful clarity. He had labeled the folder carefully, kept the notes, made sure it was all in my name. He must have seen the pattern forming, must have worried about what would happen to me after he was gone. He had not lived to watch Jessica close the door on me, but he had prepared me for this moment. I went back to the desk and pulled out a smaller envelope tucked inside the folder. Inside were copies of emails, correspondence David had printed and saved. Michael thanking him for help. Jessica chiming and promising repayment once the business stabilized or once Michael's promotion came through. Lines of reassurance written with the ease of people who never intended to follow through. I read until my eyes blurred. At last, I set the papers back into the folder and closed it firmly. The sound of the cover snapping shut echoed in the quiet study. I sat very still, my hands resting on top of it. The evidence was undeniable now. Michael and Jessica had not stumbled into debt or temporary hardship. They had treated David like a limitless resource. And they had erased me from their lives while continuing to benefit from mine. A sharp clarity washed through me, steadier than anger, stronger than grief. I was not paranoid. I was not imagining slights or exaggerating absences. They had been using me financially and emotionally for years. I looked around the study at David's books lined neatly on the shelves, at the lamp glowing softly in the corner, at the chair that still carried the shape of his shoulders. I felt him there with me, not in sorrow, but in strength. I whispered into the quiet, my voice barely more than a breath. They think I am powerless, but I am not. The roses rustled outside, a steady rhythm in the night air. I rested back against the chair, my pulse slowing, my breath evening out. The folder lay solid beneath my hand, the truth undeniable, the path ahead beginning to take shape in my mind. I did not know yet exactly what I would do, but I knew one thing with certainty. The days of being silent, of letting myself be erased, were over. I stared at the folder for what felt like hours, my hand resting on the cover as if it could steady the storm inside me. At last, I reached for the phone again. My fingers hesitated over the numbers, but then I pressed them one by one until I heard the familiar ring on the other end. Michael answered on the third ring. "Hey, Mom." He said, his voice casual, as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just called me paranoid the night before. I did not waste time. "I found the records, Michael. Every loan, every note you signed." His silence stretched for a beat too long. Then he chuckled, lightly forced. "Mom, those were just formalities. Dad knew it. He never expected me to pay those back." My grip tightened on the phone. Formalities. You call $75,000 for your house a formality, $60,000 for your startup, 20 here, 10 there, over $170,000, Michael. His voice faltered, then steadied defensive now. It was Dad's choice. He wanted to help. He told me not to worry about paying him back. I felt my chest burn. That is not what these papers say. These are contracts, with your signature, with promises to repay. He exhaled sharply, and I could almost hear him pacing. Mom, you are twisting this. He was generous. That was who he was. He would never have held me to those notes. I closed my eyes, remembering David's careful handwriting, his steady pen marking each payment that never came. He believed in you, Michael, and you turned that belief into a free pass. His voice rose. Why are you bringing this up now? You never cared before, because I didn't know. I said, my voice steady low. Dad handled it. But I know now. There was a long silence then, his tone turned sharp, brittle. You are being ridiculous. Paranoid. You always think Jessica is out to get you now. You think I am trying to cheat you. This is why we keep things simple. I let the words settle, let them sting, and then I spoke each word like stone laid on stone. I am not paranoid. I am finally awake. He was breathing hard now. What do you want me to do? Write you a check for everything, bankrupt myself? I almost laughed, the sound bitter in my throat. You and Jessica have lived well enough. You found money for trips to Europe, for private schools, for cars. You had money for everything except paying back what you owed your parents. He did not reply right away. I could hear the hum of the line, the faint murmur of Jessica's voice in the background. Then he said flatly, Mom, this is not healthy. Maybe you need help. The words sliced through me, but they no longer had the power he thought they did. I straightened in my chair. The only help I need is my own clarity. I know exactly what has been happening, and I will not let it continue. His voice cracked with sudden urgency. What are you saying? I looked down at the folder at the pages of numbers and broken promises. I am saying that I am done. I will not be your safety net anymore. Mom, come on, you can't mean that. We are family. Family doesn't erase family from their lives. Family doesn't lie to children about why their grandmother isn't there. Family doesn't take without giving back. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he might hang up. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but edged with anger. If you want to make this into a war, then fine. But don't expect us to come running when you need something. I let the words land and then answered, I have lived without you for years, Michael. I will manage. I ended the call before he could respond. The dial tone filled the room steady and final. I set the phone down and looked again at the study around me. David's chair, his books, his careful records. He had trusted me with all of it, and I had let myself believe silence was easier than truth. Not anymore. I walked through the house, slowly touching the walls, the framed photographs, the familiar furniture. Every room carried decades of memories, but now I saw it differently. Not as a home that kept me safe, but as a cage that held me in place while my son and his wife erased me piece by piece. The decision began to form as I stood in the living room, staring at the roses swaying in the dark outside. Selling the house had once been unthinkable. This was where David and I had built our lives, where Michael had grown up, where every memory lived. But now I saw it for what it was. The house tied me to them, gave them leverage, made me predictable. If I sold it, I would be free. The thought steadied me, gave me a clarity I had not felt in years. Patricia's real estate office was still down on Hillsborough Street, the same one that had sold our neighbor's place so quickly last spring. I had her card in a drawer. I went to the kitchen, opened the small box where I kept spare keys stamps and business cards, and found it. Her neat handwriting was still on the back, a note about calling any time. My fingers closed around the card. For the first time since David's funeral, I felt my chest expand with something close to relief. I whispered to the quiet house, not as a plea but as a promise. This ends here. The roses rustled again outside, and I stood very still listening to the sound as if David himself was urging me forward. The choice was mine now, and I was ready to make it. The next morning I woke with a sense of resolve I had not felt in years. The sun poured across the bedroom floor, lighting the faded rug, and I sat on the edge of the bed listening to the quiet. My decision from the night before had not wavered. If I wanted to reclaim my life, I had to act. By 9 o'clock, I had Patricia Gomez's card in my hand. I dialed her number before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk but warm, the voice of someone used to handling delicate matters. "Mrs. Caldwell, good morning. How can I help you?" I took a steadying breath. "Patricia, I want to sell my house." There was no hesitation on her end. "When would you like to meet?" We arranged for her to come that afternoon. When I hung up, my hands trembled, but not from fear. It felt like energy, like motion, like something inside me had finally awakened. Patricia arrived promptly at 2, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She was sharp-eyed, efficient, her heels clicking across the hardwood as she walked through the rooms. She paused at the mantel at the bay window at the old dining table. "Beautiful property," she said, jotting notes. "Houses in this neighborhood are moving quickly." When we sat down in the study, she opened her portfolio and adjusted her glasses. "Before we proceed, I need to verify ownership. Do you have the deed?" I handed her the file. David had kept the one I had pulled from the cabinet. She unfolded it, scanned the lines, and then looked up at me with a small nod. "It is entirely in your name. No joint ownership. No trusts. That makes everything much simpler." A warmth spread through me at her words. For years I had thought of this house as ours, mine and David's, but hearing that it was mine alone gave me a strength I had not expected. Patricia smiled faintly. "Many widows find themselves with complicated legal tangles. You, Mrs. Caldwell, have complete control. Complete control." The phrase settled over me like a cloak. After Patricia left with promises to prepare a market analysis, I wandered the house with new eyes. Each room carried memories, but I no longer felt trapped by them. Instead, I felt possibility, as though each memory could be carried with me without the weight of these walls. That evening, as I was brewing tea, the doorbell rang. I hesitated, wiping my hands on a towel before opening the door. Carol Miller stood there holding a casserole dish covered in foil. She wore practical shoes, her gray hair pulled back neatly, her expression warm. "Hello, Maggie. I hope I'm not intruding. I made lasagna and thought you might like some." I stepped aside, touched by the gesture. "Please come in." We sat at the kitchen table, the casserole between us. Carol's eyes moved around the room, not with calculation, but with genuine interest. "This is such a lovely home. You can feel the years in it." I nodded, unsure how to reply. After a pause, Carol folded her hands. "I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but your son stopped by yesterday." My chest tightened. "What did he say?" "He asked if I'd noticed any changes in you. Forgetfulness, confusion. Anything that might suggest you weren't managing. Heat rose in my face, a mix of anger and humiliation. My own son canvassing the neighbors to test my sanity. Carol's expression softened, but her voice was firm. I told him what I have seen. I told him you are up every morning tending your roses, keeping your home in order, sharp as anyone I know. I told him you are perfectly capable of making your own decisions. The words washed over me, soothing and fierce all at once. For months I had felt alone in this battle, dismissed and diminished. And here was my neighbor, unprompted, standing up for me. "Thank you, Carol," I whispered. She smiled, pushing the casserole a little closer. "You deserve better than to be questioned like that." We talked for another hour about her husband's retirement, her plans to travel, the small frustrations of everyday life. The conversation flowed easily, without judgment, without hidden motives. When she finally left, the house felt less empty than it had in years. I carried the casserole to the counter, but what stayed with me was not the food. It was her words. "You are perfectly capable." For the first time since David's death, I did not feel like I was fighting alone. I had Patricia with her sharp eyes and quiet encouragement, and now Carol with her simple, unwavering defense. As I walked back into the study, I rested my hand on the folder again. The papers still whispered of betrayal, but now there was something louder rising inside me. Not just grief, not just anger. Resolve. I whispered to the quiet room, not as a question, but as a vow. They think they have erased me, but they are wrong. The roses outside stirred in the evening breeze, and for the first time in years, I felt the steady rhythm of allies beside me. The morning after Carol's visit, I felt a steadiness in my chest that surprised me. I moved through my routine with a quiet rhythm, making coffee, watering the roses, opening the windows to let the autumn air drift through the rooms. For the first time in months, I was not entirely weighed down by silence. That was when Carol knocked on my door again, her expression less easy this time. "Maggie," she said as soon as I opened it, "I need to tell you something." "May I come in?" I stepped aside, and she walked quickly to the kitchen table, setting down her purse, like someone carrying a burden too heavy to hold alone. She smoothed her blouse, then looked at me, her eyes serious. "You know the Johnsons down on Glenwood?" I nodded. "Well, Henry Johnson works at a law office. Yesterday he overheard Michael and Jessica meeting with an attorney there, a man named Collins." I felt the air shift around me. Meeting with a lawyer, Carol leaned forward. "Henry said they were asking questions about guardianship, about how it works when an older parent isn't capable anymore. They wanted to know how to get authority over finances, property decisions." My breath caught. Guardianship. The word landed heavy in the pit of my stomach. It was not just exclusion anymore, not just whispers and absence. They were looking for ways to take everything from me while I was still alive. I gripped the edge of the table. "Are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "Henry said he couldn't hear every detail, but he heard enough. He told me because he knew we were neighbors. He thought you should be aware." A chill worked its way up my spine, but underneath it something hot burned. Fear and anger tangled together. They wanted to paint me as incompetent, to strip me of control over my own life, my own house, my own choices. I forced my voice steady. "Thank you, Carol. I'm glad you told me." She reached across the table, resting her hand on mine. "You need to protect yourself. Do you have a lawyer?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She squeezed my hand. "Then get one. You have every right to fight this." After she left, the quiet returned, but it no longer felt like silence. It was charged now, urgent. I walked back to David's study and pulled out the folder again. The notes, the signature, the promissory agreements. Evidence not of confusion, but of clarity. Proof that I knew exactly what had happened. Proof that I had tracked every betrayal, every debt. I set them in neat piles across the desk, labeling each stack with sticky notes. Startup loan, house down payment, car loan, travel expenses. Over $170,000 documented and unpaid. My hand no longer trembled. Then I opened my laptop, something I rarely used, and searched for elder law attorneys in Raleigh. Names and numbers appeared on the screen, but one caught my eye, a firm that specialized in protecting seniors from exploitation. I dialed the number before doubt could creep in. The receptionist answered, cheerful and professional, and within minutes I had an appointment for the next afternoon. When I hung up, I sat very still, staring at the folder spread across the desk. They thought they could declare me unfit. They thought they could strip away the very last pieces of independence I had. But I had more than memories on my side. I had facts, documents, signatures. I had my wits, and I had allies. That night I barely slept, but it was not the restless tossing of grief. It was the wakefulness of strategy, of anticipation. I replayed the words Michael had used when he called me paranoid Jessica's whisper at brunch, the calculated way they had cut me out of gatherings. And now the audacity of trying to place me under guardianship, to treat me as if I were some fragile relic, incapable of thought. By morning, my plan was clear. I gathered the documents into a leather folder and dressed carefully, choosing a navy sweater and pressed slacks, clothing that made me feel solid and sure. At the attorney's office, a young woman named Rachel greeted me, her handshake firm. She listened as I explained, her eyes narrowing at the details, her pen moving swiftly across a legal pad. When I showed her the contracts and the signatures, she nodded with professional certainty. These are enforceable. And more importantly, Mrs. Caldwell, they show you are not only competent but meticulous. Anyone suggesting otherwise will have a difficult case to make. Her words settled in me like stones forming a foundation. I am not powerless, I thought. I am not alone. Rachel helped me draw up a set of protective measures, powers of attorney that I designated to no one a living will, and a clear statement of my independence. She told me to keep the documents in a safe place and assured me that if Michael or Jessica tried to move forward with guardianship, I would be notified and fully defended. As I left her office folder in hand, I felt lighter, not because the threat had disappeared, but because I was prepared. That evening, Carol stopped by again, this time with a plate of cookies. I poured us both tea and told her everything Rachel had said. Carol's eyes gleamed with approval. Good. Let them try. They'll learn quickly that you're not someone to be pushed aside. I smiled at her words, a small smile, but real. For the first time in years, I felt the shift of balance. Not in their favor, but in mine. When she left, I stood in the doorway, looking at the roses David had planted so long ago. Their petals caught the fading light, sturdy despite the season. I touched the railing of the porch and let the air fill my lungs. They wanted guardianship. They wanted control. But I was ready now, armed with truth, with allies, with law. The thought carried me back inside, where the folder waited on the desk like a shield. For years I had been silent. Now silence was no longer an option. The day of Emma's 13th birthday came quietly, without an invitation, without a word from Michael or Jessica. I woke that morning knowing there would be balloons and cake somewhere across town, laughter spilling out of a house I once thought of as part of my family. I tried to busy myself with chores, polishing the silver David had left me trimming the roses, but the silence pressed heavy against my chest. By evening, the phone on the kitchen counter buzzed, the screen lighting up with Emma's name. My heart leapt. I swiped quickly to answer, forcing my voice calm. "Hello, sweetheart." Her voice was hushed, urgent, the way children speak when they know they are doing something forbidden. "Grandma, why didn't you come to my party?" The words sliced through me. I swallowed, searching for the right response. "I wasn't invited, Emma." She hesitated, then whispered, "That's what I thought. Mom said you don't like kids anymore. She said you don't like noise or parties or being around us." For a moment, I could not breathe. My own granddaughter fed lies about me, lies designed to erase me from her heart. "Emma, that is not true. I love you and I love your brother. I would never stay away because I didn't want to see you." There was a silence, then her voice cracked. "I knew it. You never seemed like you didn't like us. Mom said you wanted quiet, but I didn't believe it." Tears pricked my eyes. I pressed the phone closer as if I could close the distance. "I want you to know, Emma, I have never been too tired for you. I never chose quiet over you." She sniffled softly. "Grandma, I took some pictures. I'll send them to you." She hung up quickly before Jessica could catch her. A moment later, my phone buzzed again with a string of images. I opened them one by one. Emma with a party hat, her eyes bright, but her smile subdued. A cake with candles, family gathered around. I zoomed in and saw myself missing in every frame, a gap in the pictures where I should have been standing. I leaned against the counter, letting the weight of it wash over me. Jessica hadn't only lied to me, she had lied to her own daughter. She had built a story in which I was a cranky old woman who didn't care, and she had planted that story in Emma's heart. My hands shook as I scrolled back through the photos. I saw Michael in the background, distracted, smiling faintly. Jessica stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm like she owned every piece of him. The guests looked content, unaware of the absence she had engineered. I thought of Emma's voice on the phone, the relief when she said she knew it wasn't true. That relief was my saving grace, proof that despite Jessica's schemes, Emma still felt the truth in her bones. I sank into a chair, clutching the phone. Memories of David teaching Michael to ride a bike in the yard flashed in my mind, memories of the family we had built together. And now this woman had not only cut me out, but twisted the story so that my granddaughter thought I had chosen to walk away. The anger rose hot in my chest, but beneath it was grief deep and raw. I whispered into the empty kitchen, "David, she is poisoning them against me. She is poisoning our grandchildren." The clock ticked loudly in the silence. I knew then that the fight was no longer only about money or property. It was about truth. It was about Emma knowing who I really was, about reclaiming the place Jessica had stolen in her mind. I pressed my palm flat against the table, steadying myself. They wanted to erase me, but Emma had reached out anyway. She had found her way back to me, even if just for a few whispered words on the phone. That meant there was still hope. I looked again at the images, my heart aching with both pain and resolve. Jessica's lies could spread through parties and holidays, but they could not erase the truth that lived between a grandmother and her granddaughter. I wiped my cheeks and gathered the phone, the photos still glowing on the screen. For the first time in a long while, I felt more than anger. I felt purpose. Emma believed in me, and that was enough to keep me moving forward. The for sale sign went up on a bright Friday morning, the letters bold against the green of the lawn. I watched Patricia hammer it into the ground, her confidence steady while my chest filled with a mixture of relief and fear. The house had been my anchor for 40 years, but now it was my weapon too. By the afternoon, the neighbors already knew whispers passing from porch to porch. The next day, I was making tea when I saw Michael's SUV swing into the driveway gravel, crunching under the tires. Jessica climbed out on the passenger side, her sunglasses already perched like armor, her steps sharp and fast across the walkway. Michael trailed behind her, jaw tight. I opened the door before they could knock. Jessica brushed past me into the living room as if the house still belonged to her. Michael followed, running his hand through his hair, his face flushed with agitation. "What the hell is this, Mom?" he snapped, pointing toward the window where the sign stood clear as day. "Mrs. Chen told us there are showings scheduled." Jessica's voice cut sharper than his. "You can't do this. This is the family home. You don't have the right to sell it." I set the teacup down on the table with care, my movements calm in contrast to their frenzy. "Actually, Jessica, I do. It is my house in my name alone." Her laugh was quick, bitter. "That's ridiculous. This home belongs to all of us, to Michael, to the kids. You're being selfish, irrational." I stood, the words rising inside me like something long overdue. "No, say this is my house, my decision, my power." Michael froze mid-step, his mouth half open but silent. Jessica's face reddened, her lips pressed tight before she hissed, "You don't understand what you're doing." I walked toward the window, letting the afternoon sun light my face. "For years, you've treated me like a guest in my own family, Jessica, excluding me from birthdays, holidays, every memory that mattered. You whispered to me that I wasn't needed anymore. And now you come here to tell me I have no say." Michael shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. "Mom, please, let's not do this right now." I turned to him, my voice firm but steady. "No, Michael. We are doing this right now. Because for years I have kept quiet, hoping silence would keep peace. But silence only gave you permission to erase me." Jessica crossed her arms, her voice rising. "We were protecting you. You can't handle the stress. You can't handle the noise." "Protecting me?" I repeated, my chest burning. "Or protecting yourself from sharing space with me? Emma already knows the truth, Jessica. She knows you lied." For the first time, I saw Jessica falter, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes before she masked it with anger. Michael finally spoke, his voice lower. "Mom, selling the house is extreme. Where will you go? How will you manage?" I met his gaze evenly. "I will manage just fine. I've already spoken to professionals, and I am prepared." Jessica shook her head, exasperated. "You don't know what you're doing." But I did. I knew more than they imagined. My power wasn't in shouting, it was in the quiet certainty of ownership, of proof of independence that no one could strip from me. The silence stretched between us, the kind that forces truth into the open. Michael shifted again but said nothing. Jessica's cheeks flushed deeper, her anger unable to find purchase. I stepped closer, my voice calm. "You wanted to make decisions without me to erase me from the family. Now I am making a decision without you. This house, this choice belongs to me." Jessica's lips parted, then closed again. Michael lowered his eyes, his shoulders slumping, no words coming. I turned back toward the kitchen, signaling the conversation was over. The balance had shifted, not in a loud explosion, but in the simple, undeniable fact of control. For the first time in years, the power was mine. Patricia called me 3 days after the sign went up, her voice brisk, but carrying a note of satisfaction. "Maggie, we have a serious buyer. They came in strong, 20,000 above, asking no contingencies, quick closing." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, letting the numbers sink in. 20,000 over. It felt like validation, like proof that my decision was not reckless, but right. We set the closing date for 3 weeks out. I spent the first few days moving slowly through the rooms, pulling open drawers that had not been touched in years. In the dining room, I found China David, and I had used maybe twice our wedding crystal wrapped in tissue yellowed with age. I set most of it in boxes marked for donation. In the living room, the shelves sagged with books Michael had left behind in college, dusty and forgotten. I packed a few for myself and gave the rest to the library. Each room was its own farewell. The kitchen with the scuffed counters where I had kneaded bread, the marks on the doorway where David had measured Michael's height year after year, the porch where we watched summer storms roll in. My fingers lingered on each memory, but I forced myself to let go. The things I chose to keep were few, but precious. David's letters tied with a ribbon frayed at the edges. The quilt my mother had sewn when I was young. Photo albums filled with birthdays, graduations, the messy hair and sticky fingers of Michael's childhood. Everything else could go. One evening, while folding clothes into a suitcase, my phone buzzed again with Emma's name. I answered quickly, my voice catching with both joy and caution. "Grandma," she whispered, "Dad doesn't know I'm calling. I just wanted to say I miss you." I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the phone. "I miss you too, sweetheart." She hesitated, then rushed the words. "Mom says you're moving to Wilmington. Is that true?" I smiled faintly. "Yes." "I think it's time for a new chapter." Her voice brightened, a mix of curiosity and hope. "Can I visit you there?" Pleased tears welled as I pressed a hand to my chest. "Of course you can. I would love that." She giggled softly, then grew serious again. "Mom says you don't like being around us, but I know that's not true." I closed my eyes, letting the hurt fade beneath her certainty. "You're right, Emma. That's not true. I want you to always remember that." We spoke for a few more minutes about her school, about a book she was reading, about the ocean she had never seen but dreamed about. When we said goodbye, I sat still, the room around me glowing with a new light. Emma had promised she would come, and that promise was worth more than any furniture or heirloom I could leave behind. The days passed in a rhythm of sorting and packing. Patricia stopped by with updates, each one confirming how eager the buyers were. They were a young couple relocating for work, full of energy and plans. They wanted to move quickly, and I wanted the same. On the final week before closing, I walked through the house one last time, touching the walls lightly with my fingertips. In David's old office, I paused longest, remembering the night I pulled out the folder that changed everything. I whispered a quiet thank you to him for his foresight, for leaving me with strength hidden in paperwork. By the last night, the house stood bare, its echoes sharper without the clutter of life. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip low behind the trees. The roses still bloomed stubborn against the coming cold, and I thought of Emma's laughter through the phone, her promise to visit me by the ocean. The ache of leaving pressed hard against my ribs, but underneath it was a steady thrum of hope. I was walking away not into emptiness, but into possibility. When the moving truck pulled into the driveway the next morning, I was ready. Eli. The first morning in Wilmington greeted me with the sound of gulls and the scent of salt carried on the breeze through my open window. My new apartment overlooked the water, a modest second-floor space with a balcony that felt like freedom itself. The walls were bare, waiting for pictures and color, but instead of emptiness, I saw possibility. I unpacked, slowly setting David's letters in the nightstand drawer, placing the quilt over my bed, arranging the photo albums on the shelf in the living room. Within a week, Patricia had connected me with a local community center. I joined a book club that met every Tuesday evening in a bright library room, the shelves stacked high with novels and biographies. The first night I sat quietly at the table, unsure if I belonged, until a woman named Linda leaned over and asked my opinion on the story we were reading. My voice came out tentative at first, then stronger, as the others listened with interest. By the end of the meeting, I had 3 invitations for coffee. On Thursdays, I attended watercolor classes, my brush shaky but eager across the page. I painted the horizon I saw each morning, blues and grays bleeding together the line where ocean met sky, reminding me that endings could also be beginnings. Life began to take on a rhythm I had not felt since before David's passing. I walked along the shore in the mornings, sand cool beneath my shoes, the waves reminding me with each crash that nothing stays still forever. Michael called on a Sunday afternoon. I answered after letting the phone ring twice, steadying myself. His voice was softer than I remembered, tired around the edges. "Mom, I just wanted to check in. I heard you settled in Wilmington." I kept my tone calm. "Yes, I have. It's beautiful here." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. I think I let things get too far. Jessica and I should not have shut you out the way we did. I'm sorry." For a moment, I let the silence stretch the apology hanging between us. I believed he meant it, but I also knew regret could not erase years of exclusion. I said gently, "Michael, I hope you mean that. But I am not coming back to what was. If you want a relationship, it will be on new terms." He exhaled heavily, but I heard something in his voice I had not heard in years. "Respect." "I understand," he said quietly. After we hung up, I stood on the balcony, letting the sound of the waves carry away the ache his words left behind. Jessica, on the other hand, could not let go. She called once, her voice sharp, accusing me of tearing the family apart. I listened without answering, then ended the call when she began to shout. Weeks later, a letter arrived, her handwriting neat but uneven, the words careful. She admitted she had tried to control everything, afraid of being left out herself. She wrote that Michael had begun to question her decisions, that Emma asked about me more often, that she felt something slipping beyond her reach. At the end, she wrote only, "I am sorry." I folded the letter and set it in the same drawer with David's notes. Whether I chose to forgive her fully was not something I had to decide that day. Emma called often, her voice bright with excitement about her first trip to the ocean. She described packing seashell books for our walks, already planning which ice cream flavors she would try first when she visited. Her joy stitched together the frayed edges of my heart. One evening after book club, I walked back to my apartment and stood on the balcony, the Atlantic spread wide before me, silver under the moon. The air was cool, carrying the promise of change, of renewal. I whispered into the night. They tried to erase me, but I was the one holding the power. The tide answered with its steady rhythm, and for the first time in many years, I felt complete. My story was not over, but I had taken it back. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, Share your thoughts with me. Let me know where you are listening from, and stay with us for more stories that remind us of strength, truth, and the power we sometimes forget we hold.